Let me tell you about a man whose name still drips with blood and fear even after 5 centuries. A man whose legacy inspired one of the most famous monsters in history. His name was Vlad Dracul, but history remembers him by another name, Vlad the Impaler. The year was 1462. The Ottoman Empire was expanding, swallowing up lands and leaving only ruin in its wake. But in the dark forests of Wallachia, there was a prince who refused to bow. He was no ordinary ruler. His methods were cruel, his punishments terrifying, and yet his people feared and respected him, for he was their only shield against the invading Turks. They say that if you ventured too far into his lands, you would smell death long before you saw it, the stench of rotting corpses thick in the air. Then, in the distance, you'd see them, thousands of bodies, stretched along roads, impaled on wooden stakes, men, women, even children, their faces frozen in twisted agony, their bodies left for the crows. This was Vlad's warning to his enemies: enter his land, and you will not leave it alive. One story tells of the time when an Ottoman army marched toward Wallachia, thousands strong, believing themselves invincible. They came expecting war. What they found instead was a nightmare. As they rode deeper into Wallachian territory, they passed a great field, and there, stretching as far as the eye could see, stood a forest of corpses, tens of thousands of impaled bodies swaying in the wind. Soldiers, merchants, prisoners, all of them skewered like meat on a spit. The sheer horror of it overwhelmed them. It wasn't just the bodies, it was the silence. No birds, no insects, only death. The Ottoman commander, a man who had seen war and bloodshed countless times, took one look at the grotesque display, turned his army around, and fled. That is how Vlad won a battle without raising a single sword. But his cruelty didn't end with his enemies. Even his own people were not safe. He ruled with an iron fist, and to defy him meant a slow and painful death. One story tells of a merchant from a foreign land who visited Wallachia. He set up shop in the marketplace, and weary from his travels left a sack of golden coins outside overnight. The next morning he returned to find his coins untouched. Surprised, he asked the townspeople, "Why hasn't anyone stolen my money?" A nervous hush fell over them before one finally answered, "Because no thief would dare." The merchant was still skeptical, so he went directly to Vlad himself and asked why. Vlad smirked and said, "Because if a thief had dared, his body would be hanging from the castle walls before sunrise." It was no idle threat. Vlad's justice was absolute. Once, a nobleman complained that the common folk were starving under Vlad's rule. Rather than show mercy, Vlad decided to prove a point. He invited all the beggars, the sick, and the poor to a lavish banquet in a grand hall. Tables overflowed with roasted meats, fresh bread, and goblets of the finest wine. They ate well, they drank, they laughed, grateful for the kindness of their prince. And then Vlad locked the doors and set the building on fire. As the flames consumed them, he is said to have watched and remarked that he had solved the problem of poverty in Wallachia. Even in death, his story doesn't end. Some say he was beheaded by his enemies, his body buried in a monastery. But centuries later, when an archaeologist opened his tomb, it was empty. No body, no bones, just an open grave. Some believe Vlad never truly died, that his hunger for blood was something far worse than cruelty, that perhaps the legend of Dracula wasn't fiction after all. That is the thing about legends. They never truly die, because even today, his name still haunts the land he ruled. There are those who claim to have seen a dark figure walking near the ruins of Poenari Castle, his once mighty fortress. a lone rider on horseback, glimpsed only in the pale light of the moon before vanishing into the mist. Vlad's own end remains cloaked in mystery, shrouded by the fog of history and the fading memories of a legend. What is known with reasonable certainty is that Vlad Dracul III was killed in battle, likely around December 1476 or January 1477, during a conflict with the Ottoman forces near Bucharest. Yet, even this isn't definitive, as contemporary accounts offer conflicting narratives. Some claim he was betrayed and murdered by his own soldiers, while others insist he fell heroically against overwhelming odds. To add to the uncertainty, Vlad's burial site has never been conclusively identified. Thus, Vlad the Impaler's final fate remains as enigmatic and chilling as the tales that made him infamous. In the grand halls of Kachy's castle, a gift from her first husband hidden deep within the mountains of Hungary, there once lived a noble woman whose name became a whisper of fear, a legend so soaked in blood that even centuries later she is remembered as one of history's most monstrous killers. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory, but the world would come to know her as the Blood Countess. Born in 1560 into one of Hungary's most powerful families, Elizabeth had everything: wealth, status, and an education that far surpassed most women of her time. But what she also had was a darkness few could comprehend. They say that cruelty ran in her blood. She was raised among warriors and statesmen, exposed to the brutal realities of war and punishment from a young age. It's even rumored that one of her relatives was a known Satanist, and another had a taste for torturing peasants for amusement. Perhaps that was where it began, or maybe the sickness was always inside of her. By age 15, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a nobleman known for his skill on the battlefield and his utter ruthlessness towards his enemies. When Ferenc was away fighting wars, Elizabeth was left in charge of their vast estate, and this was when the rumors of her thirst for blood truly began. At first, the stories were mere whispers, servants disappearing, young girls entering the castle gates but never coming out. No one dared question a woman of her stature, but the truth, as it came to be known, was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Elizabeth, it was said, found a perverse pleasure in pain and death. She believed that the secret to youth and beauty lay in the blood of the innocent. Some claimed that her cruelty began when a servant girl accidentally pulled her hair while brushing it, and in a fit of rage, Elizabeth struck the girl so hard that blood splattered onto her skin, and in the moment she became obsessed. Believing the blood of young girls could preserve her beauty, Elizabeth began to kill. What started as mere beatings soon escalated into torture, unspeakable horrors carried out in the shadows of her castle walls. Servants who displeased her were whipped, burned, or pierced with needles. Some were stripped naked and forced to stand outside in the snow, doused with freezing water until they became human statues of ice. Others were subjected to iron claws, razors, and red-hot pokers, their screams echoing through the stone corridors. And the blood. Rumors spread that she bathed in it, smearing it across her face, convinced it would keep her young forever. For years, the nobility turned a blind eye to the disappearances. After all, who would believe such tales about a countess? But then she became too bold. No longer satisfied with the daughters of peasants, Elizabeth began luring the daughters of noble families to her castle, promising them positions of honor. One by one they vanished. That was her mistake. In 1610, after years of rumors, King Matthias of Hungary finally sent soldiers to her castle. What they found inside was beyond horror. Bodies, some drained of blood, Others, half dead and barely breathing, littered the dungeon floors. Torture devices soaked in crimson stood as silent witnesses to her crimes. And Elizabeth? She was caught in the act, standing over one of her victims. Her reign of terror was over. Or was it? For all her monstrous deeds, Elizabeth never faced execution. Instead, she was sentenced to a fate far worse than death: imprisonment inside her own castle. The doors and windows of her chamber were bricked up, leaving only a small opening for food and water. She was left to rot in darkness, alone with nothing but her thoughts and perhaps her ghosts. For 4 years, she remained trapped inside her stone tomb, until one night in 1614, the guards found her cold and lifeless on the floor. But even in death, her legend did not die. Some say that on dark nights, the cries of her victims still echo from the ruins of Catchi's castle. And there are those who believe that somewhere, somehow, the Blood Countess still walks among us, because after all, monsters like her don't just disappear. They become legends, and legends never die. We all know the vampire legends, pale creatures of the night rising from their graves to feed on the living. But one of the earliest official vampire investigations wasn't just a story, it actually happened. And it all started with a man named Peter Blagojevich. The year was 1725 in a small Serbian village called Kisilova. Life was hard, but the villagers went about their days as they always had, until something strange happened. Peter Blagojevich, a simple farmer, died unexpectedly. His death alone wasn't unusual, but what followed? That was something else entirely. Just days after his burial, people in the village began to fall ill. They grew weak, their faces pale, their bodies cold, and before they died, every single one of them had the same story to tell. Peter had come to them in the night. Some claimed he tried to strangle them, others that he simply stood there watching. Fear spread like wildfire. The villagers knew what they had to do. A small group of men, along with the local priest, dug up Peter's grave to see if something unnatural was happening. What they found shocked them to the core. Peter's body wasn't decayed. His skin was fresh. His nails and hair had grown longer. And worst of all, there was blood on his lips. The villagers panicked. To them, there was only one explanation. Peter had become a vampire. There was no hesitation. They did what was required. They drove a wooden stake through his heart. And as the story goes, Peter let out a horrific scream as if he were still alive. But they didn't stop there. To make sure he could never rise again, they burned his remains to ash. From that moment on, the strange death stopped. The sickness that had gripped the village vanished. Word of the event spread far beyond Kisilova. The Austrian government even conducted an official investigation, one of the first documented cases of authorities taking a vampire threat seriously. Peter Blagojevich became one of the earliest vampires in recorded history. It was the case that helped ignite Europe's vampire hysteria. But here's the thing. Stories like this didn't just happen once. Similar reports came from villages all over Serbia, Romania, and Hungary in the 18th century. Bodies that wouldn't decay, graves disturbed from within, corpses with fresh blood on their lips. Disease or superstition, why did so many witness the same horrors? Maybe the vampire legend isn't just a myth. Maybe it's something far older, something still lurking in the dark.